Welcome to Carbohydrate Counting. Hello, my name is Fiona and I'm one of the diabetes dietitians at Forth Valley Royal. The other members of the team are Emma, Lindsay and Catherine. Today's session will be covering carbohydrate counting and a quick recap on insulins. Your next session will then be a one-to-one near-me video appointment or telephone review to cover how to calculate the correct insulin dose for yourself using ratios. We will then arrange another review to see how you're getting on with the ratios. If you have been referred to complete the carbohydrate counting workshops to get a Libra sensor, we can discuss this at the last session once you have successfully completed carbohydrate counting. You should have been sent some resources prior to this video. This resource pack includes a carbohydrate counting workbook and reference table, which we will be using today, and a food diary. We will ask you to complete the food diary and email it to us before your next session. The other resources you have been sent includes the 10 Steps booklet, which is a great resource and covers some common issues with blood glucose and how to troubleshoot these, information on how to connect to Near Me, and information on uploading your blood glucose meter. As these education sessions are now virtual, we ask that you upload your meters prior to your sessions with the dietitian so we can see your meter readings and discuss them. If you are unable to do this before the next session, please get in touch. Before we get started, what are the benefits to carb counting? Most importantly, it can help improve your diabetes control and management. It helps you become more flexible with the foods and drink you eat and the times you eat. For example, you will be able to match your insulin dose to your meal rather than the other way around. And it can improve your self-management by increasing your knowledge and understanding of your blood glucose levels. But it is a skill that takes some time and motivation to develop and improve. So before we look at carbohydrates, let's have a quick look over some of the basics. HbA1c is a word which you will no doubt be familiar with, but may not actually quite understand what it means. HbA1c is what's known as glycated hemoglobin. This is something that's made when the glucose or sugar in your body sticks to your red blood cells. Your body can't use the sugar properly, so more of it sticks to your red blood cells and builds up in your blood. Red blood cells are active for around 2 to 3 months, which is why the reading is taken quarterly. Too much sugar in the blood damages your blood vessels. This damage can lead to serious problems in parts of your body like your eyes and feet. We know the higher your HbA1c, the more likely you are to develop these diabetic complications if it stays high. The ideal area we want to be in is the green zone, which gives an average daily blood glucose level of around 8.6 millimoles. You may have been given individualised targets depending on your age or other health conditions. So, moving on to insulins. This is on page 3 and 4 of your workbook. There are 2 types of insulin that act in different ways to keep blood glucose levels controlled. Using 2 insulins to control blood sugars is called multiple daily injection therapy, or MDI. The first is your background insulin, also known as basal or long-acting insulin. This insulin works in the body with the liver to provide a stable blood glucose levels when fasting. There are many different basal insulins that people may be on and will work slightly differently. If you are on Lantus, you might take this once a day and it lasts around 18 to 24 hours. Toujeo and Degludec are also insulins taken once a day. Levemir is usually taken twice a day to give more flexibility and lasts around 12 hours and is similar to Humulin I. It's important to make sure that the background insulin is working correctly before looking into changing the insulin you take with food. By fasting for part of the day, you can see if your background is working. You can read how to do this on page 3 of your booklet. The second insulin is your fast-acting, also known as bolus or food insulin. This insulin coincides with food digestion. Its peak, i.e. when it's working hardest, lasts for around 2 hours, and it lasts for 4 hours in total. However, it can take 10 to 20 minutes to be absorbed. Therefore, it's best to take at least 15 minutes before meals to avoid spikes in blood sugars. The only exception here is when you are out for dinner or ordering a takeaway, as it's difficult to know when the food will arrive and the portion size might be different to what you expect. So it's best to wait until your food arrives and take your insulin just before you eat in these situations. Like basal insulins, there are many different brands of bolus insulin, but the most common are Novorapid and Humalog. Another important thing to consider is injection sites. It is important to rotate your injection sites to avoid the development of lumpy sites. Because insulin is an anabolic hormone, it causes fat cells around the injection area to grow. So, if injections are continually injected into the same spot, it causes lipohypertrophy. If insulin is injected into these lumpy sites, it can take longer to be absorbed and then released later. Also, ensuring that fresh needles are put on your pen before injections and taken off straight after helps ensure the pen stays sterile. And making sure injections are going straight onto skin and not through clothes, as this can blunt the needle. So, now on to carbohydrate counting. There are 3 steps to carbohydrate counting. Today we are going to focus on the first 2. The first is being able to identify which foods contain carbohydrates, and second is figuring out how many carbohydrates are in the food. The third step will be discussed at your one-to-one appointment with the dietitian. You can now turn to page 5 of your workbook. The 3 main nutrients in the food we eat are fat, protein, and carbohydrates. The reason we only focus on carbohydrates when it comes to insulin and blood sugar control is because carbohydrate is the nutrient that gets broken down into sugar or glucose in our bodies, and why we need the insulin to make sure it gets used by the body and doesn't hang around in the blood for long. This slide is a picture of lots of different foods. Some are carbohydrates and therefore would require insulin, and some are not. You can pause the recording now and have a look at all the foods and see if you can decide which ones are carbohydrate and which ones are non-carbohydrate. The term carbohydrates refers to 2 types of carbohydrate. One is starchy or complex carbs, and the other is simple carbohydrates, which is an umbrella term for the sugars fructose, sucrose, and lactose. So, let's have a look at all the foods from the following slides and see how they fit into these different categories. First, we have the non-carbohydrate foods. These are the foods that are mainly fat and protein, so this includes oil used for cooking, meat and poultry, except those with breadcrumbs, hard cheese, fresh and tinned fish, but be aware if it's in a sauce that may contain some carbohydrates, salad and vegetables, with the exception of potatoes. Vegetables do contain some carbohydrate, but because they have so much fibre, their effect on blood glucose levels is quite minimal, so we don't count these for insulin, with the exception of potatoes. Nuts and eggs, which are mainly protein and fat, and finally diet drinks, which have no calorific value, therefore are also non-carbohydrate. And now onto the carbohydrate foods. First, we have the simple carbohydrates. Fructose is a sugar found in all fruit. Some will have more fructose than others, and some very low carbohydrate fruits will not require any insulin. Sucrose is essentially the standard sugar that is added to many foods, such as chocolates, biscuits and cookies, ice cream, and other confectionery. Then we have lactose. This is the sugar found in dairy foods, so can be found in yogurts and milk. However, you will have noticed that we put cheese in the non-carbohydrate section. This is because hard cheese has lost much of its lactose in its production, therefore is mainly protein and fat, and does not affect our blood sugars the same way other dairy foods do. Finally, we have the starchy carbohydrates. These include all things made from grains and cereals, such as bread products, oats, pasta and rice, all flour-based products such as pastries and cakes, potatoes and potato products, and baked beans are also in this category because beans are a starchy carbohydrate. However, here we are really counting the carbohydrates in the baked bean sauce. So when counting the carbs in baked beans, you can halve the total carbohydrate for working out your insulin, as beans on their own would be treated like vegetables because they are so high in fibre. You'll notice we didn't mention any alcohol in the categories. This is because the carbohydrates and effect we find from alcohol is treated differently to food. Alcohol or mixers do contain carbohydrates and will cause blood glucose levels to rise. However, we don't take any insulin to cover the carbohydrates in alcoholic drinks, as this can cause your blood glucose levels to fall too low. Safe drinking rules are to check blood glucose levels regularly and to eat a carbohydrate snack before bed, such as toast, cereal or crisps. And do not take any bolus or fast-acting insulin to cover the snack. This ensures you have a store of glucose in your body overnight. Normally, your liver would release glucose if your blood glucose levels did drop overnight. However, when you have consumed alcohol, the liver is processing the alcohol and is unable to release the glucose at the same time. As well as thinking about the carbohydrates in the meals we eat, it's also important to think of the carbohydrates in snacks. Snacks over 10 grams of carbs may require some insulin to cover the snacks and to prevent blood glucose level spikes. However, it's important to be mindful of the type of snack you're having, how active you have been or are going to be in the day, the time of your last bolus, and when your next meal will be. Managing snacks can be discussed more at your next appointment. Now we know what foods contain carbohydrates, we can now look at counting the carbohydrates in these foods. There are many different methods to do this, so it's about finding out which method or methods work best for you. The first method we're going to look at is using reference tables, books and apps. Reference tables can be useful if you don't have access to a food label. The reference table we have sent you contains a list of foods. It includes the serving amount, which is the purple column, the amount of carbs in the serving amount, which is the blue column, and the carbs per 100 grams, which is the white column. You can now try this activity by using the reference table to find the total carbohydrates in the following breakfast: 2 Weetabix, 200 ml of milk, and 200 ml of orange juice. You can now pause the video. So, the carbohydrates in the Weetabix was 24 grams. There is 10 grams in the milk and 20 in the orange juice, giving a total of 54 grams of carbohydrates. When adding up carbohydrate contents of individual foods that make up a meal, it's important to be as accurate as possible and to only round up or down at the end once you have your total. Another method is using the Carbs and Cals book or app. This is a great resource to get into carb counting. It was developed by a dietitian and is supported by Diabetes UK. The book is available to purchase online or the app from both Apple and Android app stores. Both the book and app give visual pictures of portion sizes, so you can best choose what portion size is most like yours, and it tells you the carbohydrate content. You can also save your favourite foods and meals to the app. Again, this might be most useful when you don't have a food label to hand, or if you are out for dinner. The book and app also contain some foods from chain restaurants. Now on to looking at the nutritional label on the back of food products. This is on page 8 of your workbook. Labels can tell us how much carbohydrate is in a food product. The nutritional label gives lots of information, but what is important is the total carbohydrates amount, not the of which sugars value. It is also important to make sure which column you are looking at, the per serving or per 100 grams. This will depend on what food it is and how much of it you're having. For some loose foods like cereal or pasta, you might not be having the serving size suggested. So in that case, to know the amount of carbohydrates in your portion, you can weigh your food to find out. This is the equation to use to calculate the carbs in a portion of food. You need to know the carbohydrates per 100 grams, which you get from the label, and the weight of the food from the scales. You can also find this equation on page 9 of your workbook, an example to try yourself. Next, I will play a video of Emma demonstrating this.
As Fiona has been mentioning, there's lots of different ways to carbohydrate count, and one of those ways is through weighing food. Weighing food is the best way to work out the exact carbohydrate content of your portion size, and this can be useful for foods like rice, pasta, and also cereal, which is the example we'll be using today. We'll be using a sum, which you can see on the board here, and it's also in your workbooks and on the previous slide. I will run through this and then we can get started on our example. So as you can see here on the first row of the sum, we have carbohydrates per 100 grams, which we will get from the label, the nutritional information label on the back of the packet. We then need to divide this number by 100, which gives us the carbohydrate content per 1 gram. We'll then take this figure and times it by the weight of the food, which we'll get from our scales. Let's try that. I'll let you know what you need to do this at home. So I've got a bowl. It'd be useful to use the one that you would normally use for this meal. I have a calculator, but of course you could use a calculator on your phone. And I've got a set of digital scales. Digital scales are a lot easier to use and a lot more accurate to use than scales with a dial. Okay, so let's get started on an example. So as we can see here, we've got the nutritional information box on the back of the packet. And we're going to look down the rows here of all the nutrients to carbohydrate, not the off which sugars row, the carbohydrate row, or sometimes it says total carbohydrates. And then we're going to look along here and use the per 100 grams column, not the per 30 grams column, which is often the recommended portion size for cereal, as most people would have more than this. So for here we can see for carbohydrates, per 100 grams, there's 82 grams. And we're going to use this in our calculation. So let's have a look at what 30 grams looks like. So first we'll put our bowl on the scales, and we'll need to zero the bowl before we weigh our cereal portion. Let's have a quick look at what 30 grams looks like to show. As we can see, 30 grams of cereal is not very much, and most people would have more than this. So let's pour in what my portion size would be. So that's 63 grams of cereal, and now we're going to use this as well as the back of the packet to input this into our calculator. So following the sum that was on the board, first we're going to input the carbohydrates per 100 grams, which was 82. So 82, and we're going to divide this by 100, which gives us 0.82. And then we're going to times this by the weight on the scales, which is 63 grams for our portion size. So that gives us 51.66 grams of carbohydrate, which we're then going to use to work out our insulin dose. So now that we've weighed out the cereal and input it into our calculator, let's go through what this would look like in the sum. So first, we've got the carbohydrates per 100 grams, which we saw from the back of the packet was 82. We want to now divide this by 100. And times by the weight of the food, which was 63 grams for the cereal. We saw from the calculator that this was 51.66, and I will round this up to 52. So we've got 52 grams of carbohydrates in our portion of cereal, but of course we need to add in the milk. So let's look at the back of the packet for milk. Okay, so now we're going to do the same calculation for milk. Sometimes a little bit harder to see looking at the back of a milk packet as there's not a table, but we're looking for the same information. So we've got carbohydrate, we can see there's 4.8 grams per 100 mils of milk. So this is what we'll input into our calculation. Let's now pour in our milk and work it out. So I will just need to zero the scales first before we pour in the milk. So it's 189 grams or mils of milk. You could also use a measuring jug when doing this, but using the same scales will work just the same. So let's now input this into our calculator. So similar to the calculation as before, we're using the number from the back of the packet. So we read that as 4.8. So that's 4.8. We're dividing this again by 100 and timesing it by the weight on the scales, which is 189. So that gives us 9.07 grams of carbohydrate per our milk portion, and then we can add this to our cereal portion on the board. So let's now input the calculation for milk onto the board. So from the back of the packet we had 4.8 grams of carbohydrates per 100 mils of milk, which we're going to divide by 100. And similar to the cereal, we're timesing this by the weight of our milk portion, which was 189 mils. Which we saw from the calculator gave us 9.07 grams. I'm going to round this to 9. So now you can see we've got 52 grams of carbohydrate for our cereal portion, 9 grams of carbohydrate for our milk portion. So when we add this together, we've got 61 grams of carbohydrates per our portion size for this meal. We will then use this to work out our insulin dose when you're using a ratio. Now that you've done this calculation once, we are not expecting you to do this every morning for your cereal. So if you often have the same cereal, the same portion size, then what you can do is mark a little permanent marker on your bowl so you know that you have that when you fill up to there, that is your portion size and how many carbohydrates are in that. Or you could use measuring cups or measuring spoons to work out your portion size that you have already calculated the carbohydrate content for.
Another way to calculate the carbohydrates in a portion of food without using the equation is to use the carbohydrate calculator. This is on page 11 of the workbook. Using this sheet, we can go along the bottom green banner to find the carbs per 100 grams in the cereal, which was 82 grams, so we'll round that to 80 grams. Then go up the red column and find the weight, which was closest to 65 grams. Then you meet in the middle and you get a number exactly the same as what was calculated using the equation. If you feel this method is more suited to you, you can annotate it with some foods you commonly eat. When weighing foods like pasta, rice or couscous, it's important to always weigh it cooked and to look for the carbs per 100 grams in the cooked amount on the label. This is because dried food absorbs water on cooking. Therefore, it's easy to weigh and calculate the carbohydrates for what you think will be your portion, but once cooked, there's too much. We'll now have a quick look at how to calculate the carbohydrates in a recipe. For example, if you're baking a cake or making macaroni cheese and you don't have a food label. First off, list all the ingredients that contain carbohydrate, then calculate the carbohydrates in the ingredients you're using. Add up the total carbohydrates, then divide that by the amount of portions the recipe makes. You can now pause the video and have a go at calculating the carbs in the ingredients for this passion cake using your reference table or Carbs and Cals. This table is also on page 10 of your workbook, along with the steps. And now we can check what you got with the answers. So now it's time to try carb counting for yourself. The food diary you have been provided with must be filled out before your next session. It should be completed for 3 to 4 days with the food you have eaten and the carbohydrate content. We will then ask you to send it to us before your next session. When filling out the food diary, make sure you enter your fasting blood glucose level, the time of your meal, your blood glucose before the meal, as well as the food eaten, the carbohydrates, and any snacks, including any activity you do in the day. Below is also a section for you to write in any hypos, what you think might have caused it, and your treatment. Lastly, you will have been given a link to a short quiz in your email, so you can test yourself on what you have learnt today. At the end of the quiz, you can click See Results to see how you did. That is all for today. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about today's sessions, or have any questions about using Near Me or uploading your meter, please do not hesitate to get in touch.